am your host, Nancy Kaufman, Interim Denominational Minister for Church Safety for Mennonite Church USA. Tonight I am joined by Reverend Dr. Michael Danner. He is the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality in Mennonite Church USA, which supports area conferences, congregations, pastors, and pastors in their ministry. Prior to serving this role, Michael served as conference minister for Illinois Mennonite Conference. He also has had over 20 years of experience as a local congregational pastor, serving 17 of those years as pastor of Metamora Mennonite Church in Illinois. Michael has extensive experience in abuse prevention and accountability work in the church. Tonight's gathering is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat for resources for you. Spanish interpretation is available using the globe button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive the link in a follow-up email. Our webinars are also available on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that arise as we make a presentation here. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions. We will also answer some of the ones that you have previously submitted as you registered. Let us open with prayer. God, we meet together because we care about the health of the church and the integrity of our actions to strengthen the body. We lean on you, God, for wisdom, clarity, and direction. In Christ's name, amen. Michael, I should say this before we get started, sorry. I just want you to be aware that this webinar will cover topics related to sexual abuse, which may trigger for some of you some emotions and feelings. Your well-being is important, so please feel free to step away or exit the webinar at any time. A recording will be available if you decide to join at a more suitable time for you. And as we are beginning this whole process, I do want to give a little bit of a historical update on the document before Michael begins his presentation. Just to let you know that regarding this present prevention and accountability document that we are talking about tonight, when Mennonite Church USA formed in 2002, there was a misconduct policy in place at that time. That policy was from an earlier version that had its birth in 1999-2000. In 2016, Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada collaborated on making some major updating of that policy to bring more clarity to the process. It tightened the timeline. It addressed some of the issues with the old document. It also updated the language and definitions. It also closed some loopholes that had been in the policy back then, and also to make the document a little bit more victim-centered, and overall, just to try to make it a more balanced and fair process. The title of that version was Ministerial Sexual Misconduct Policy and Procedure. Even though the word sexual was put in at the advice of the lawyers from both countries at that time, The understanding has always been that it would address other pastoral misconduct. About the same time, what has been the 1996 A Mennonite Polity for Ministerial Leadership was updated to the 2017 document, A Shared Understanding of Ministerial Leadership, which is a backbone for this policy. But while our present document has been a useful document to guide us in addressing with integrity complaints of misconduct of any kind by a church leader, it is important to update it to reflect new learnings of that which would be more useful to the church. The document is not meant to be punitive, but to hold our credentialed leaders accountable by having a fair and balanced process to guide the church when there is a complaint for the benefit of all involved. That is a brief introduction. And now at this time, Michael, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you also for your work with the 2017 policy and procedure, and also for your work as the interim denominational minister for church safety at MCUSA. And we appreciate your commitment to making the church as safe as possible for children and vulnerable adults. And your work continues to bear fruit in the church. So thank you for that. And it's a pleasure working with you. So let's talk a bit about tonight. So tonight's we're going to be talking about the prevention and accountability resource. And just to be clear, there is a delegate resolution that accompanies this resource that's about how this resource sits in the system relative to the bylaws. We are not going to talk about that tonight. That's not part of our context. We will have another webinar in June that talks specifically about that resolution. So if you have questions about that, maybe put a pin in that and come back to that next one where we talk about the resolution. So tonight we are talking about what we call, or what we've named, the prevention and accountability resource. This is an updated resource for abuse prevention and accountability within MCUSA when there are violations of or misconduct. It's important to note that it builds on the foundation of what is called a shared understanding of ministerial leadership. That is a pastoral ethics and a leadership kind of theological document that helps us understand leadership, healthy leadership in the church from an Anabaptist perspective, expectations for pastors and leaders in local churches, and what some basic ethical guidelines are for pastors. What we found is that while the foundation of that is good, there's some gaps in that resource that need to be filled in with better policies, more clarity around misconduct processes. And so that's what this resource hopes to do. So it builds on the foundation of a shared understanding, but it does replace the ministerial sexual misconduct policies and procedures of 2016 that Nancy was just talking about. So this resource will supplant that. The processes and policies in this resource will they'll actually replace the current misconduct, sexual misconduct policies and procedures. So that document's going away. This document's and these processes are in their place. So tonight, what I want to do is actually just provide a brief orientation to this resource. What is it? How is it organized? A little bit about our polity that guided kind of what we were doing when we were working with it. Talk about the new administrative and response structure to abuse, to responding to abuse complaints, and also then to highlight some key changes or some things that are different in this policy and process from what came before. So that's the goal. With that said, the document is 88 pages long. There is a link to it in the chat. If you haven't found that through the MCUSA website, there's a link there. I encourage you to open that, download that, and spend some time with it. We'll just scratch the surface really tonight. And so I also encourage you, as you go through this document and spend some time with it, to feel free to reach out to me. Crystal will eventually put my email in the chat as well. If you have questions, comments, anything, any kind of feedback you might have as you go through it, or questions for clarity, feel free to reach out at any time, and we're glad to engage because this is an important it's an important resource in the church, and we want you to understand that, and also to feel open to email me, or if it's a question for Nancy, her as well. So with that said, let's talk basically about the starting point, which is a few words about MCUSA polity, because some questions we have actually come out of this understanding. And so on page 5 of the resource, it does, starting on page 4, actually, it does have a word about MCUSA policy and the way that we understand congregational autonomy, conference authority, and the way this works. But on page 5, there's the question, why is this important? Why is polity an important consideration? And I just want to read some of that to you. So when it comes to abuse prevention and when it comes to accountability in the case of misconduct, the polity of MCUSA matters because congregations are responsible for some things, conferences are responsible and accountable for other things, and the denomination or at the national level is accountable for other things still. So there's 3 levels in the church, the folks that have responsibility when it comes to abuse prevention and responding to misconduct. The local congregation is responsible for abuse prevention in their context, and they're responsible for creating and following good abuse prevention policies and practices. The local congregation is responsible for accountability in the instance that a congregation member steps outside of those policies and procedures. The area conference and the Safe Church Ministry of MCUSA provide support and guidance for best practices. But our polity, which is the structure of our relationships together, our polity does not allow the conference or the national office to have direct authority over congregation members. All right. So what dictates the relationship between the individual congregational members is the membership covenant and the understanding of what it means to be church together in a particular congregation. That is the responsibility of the local church. We want to help you with that. We want to help provide resources so that you can create safe spaces, but ultimately there's some work that belongs to the congregation. At the same time, the local congregation is actually the employer of their staff. So any pastor that's paid or unpaid, any pastor or person in a ministerial leadership role, they are the responsibility of local congregational leadership. That means that the congregation has oversight and accountability responsibilities for the pastor that is unique to their role as an employer, right? So they also have HR responsibilities and limits relative to their employees. There's certain parameters that churches have to abide by, which we won't get into detail, but that's something to remember. Again, the area conference and the Safe Church Ministry of MCUSA provide support and guidance for best practices. We support congregations in that work, but it is a responsibility that rests with the congregation. However, and this is really important, there is a key exception. All right. So when a person serves in the role of pastor in a congregation or that person is credentialed by the conference, it creates an accountability relationship between that person and the area conference, right? So in those cases, the area conference is responsible for abuse prevention, including the education of those credentialed leaders and accompanying those credentialed leaders in ministry. And they're accountable for the response if a pastor or credentialed leader is accused of misconduct. The area conference partners with the Safe Church Ministry of MCUSA to ensure that abuse prevention and accountability processes are thorough and consistent with the goals and the values of MCUSA. And the idea in this partnership between area conference and the national office is that there would be consistency across our area conferences and the way we understand and define what abuse is, the way we respond to complaints or misconduct complaints or reports of potential misconduct. We want there to be consistency across that system, and that's why we work together as conferences and a national body to use a unified policy and a process like this for the safety of the church. So hopefully that makes sense. As Nancy said, this policy is consistent with previous policies. We aim to be trauma informed. In other words, we don't want persons to be re-traumatized through the process of reporting misconduct or engaging in misconduct processes or accountability processes. We want to be survivor focused as well, realizing that how a church responds and how a conference and the denomination respond to incidents of abuse affect more than just the people directly involved, but anybody that's experienced abuse or misconduct in any context and also has past experience with misconduct in the church. So we keep all those things in mind as we think through how do we communicate, how do we adjudicate, how do we respond most appropriately to different kinds of misconduct as they come. So let's move on to talk about the resource structure itself. You'll notice that the name is intentional. It's called the Prevention and Accountability Resource. Maybe you could take a guess that it's going to be organized into two sections. One section is going to be abuse prevention, and that's part one of the resource. And the second part of the resource is the accountability section, which deals with accountability. So just kind of table of contents view of things. The prevention aspect of it includes a code of conduct, which some very specific guidelines and behavioral guardrails for pastors that we expect pastors and ministries to follow. There is a section on ethical practices, which builds on the shared understanding, but provides more detail that I'd invite you to look at. This is what we expect of all of our pastors and people in ministerial roles. What's new that's different than maybe what we had in the past, or some addition to what we've had in the past, is the next section, which is the best practices for congregations in support of abuse prevention. And so this is where we look at how do we help to equip congregations with best practices for abuse prevention, followed by best practices for congregations as employers. And so, like I mentioned before, the congregation is the employer of the pastor, therefore they have responsibilities for supervision and accountability. So there's a section of resources of best practices in the P&A resource to help you as a congregation understand how to do that well, and how to do that within the context of church ministry, which is different than other employers, but nonetheless is still important. So there's the best practices for congregation as employers, and then a whole section on the best practices for clergy in support of their own health, right? So it's a shared responsibility. The congregation creates the context for safety for children and vulnerable adults. It creates a context of good supervision and accompaniment for pastors. And then also the pastor has responsibility for self-care in the midst of ministry and self-management in the midst of ministry, so that all three of these work together to try to ensure that the church is the safest place it can possibly be, so that people can thrive. The other part of the end part then of section 1 on prevention is a policy checklist, which is just a set of policies that oftentimes churches don't think about needing to have. And so I would encourage you, one of the pre-questions we have is what would you encourage lay leaders to spend time with if they're not going to read all 88 pages, which part? I would really encourage you to lean in on part 1 on prevention, and to follow up some of those resources, because you do the work of trying to create that context where children and vulnerable adults are actually valued, that they are treated with respect and dignity, and that everyone's doing all they can to create a safe environment for them in the church. So that's part 1 of the process. Part 2 then is about accountability. And so accountability deals with what happens then when somebody transgresses. So we go through all the work, we create and clearly communicate the guidelines and ethical practices, and we have healthy boundaries training, and we do all these things, and yet there still is a violation that may occur or a report of misconduct that might happen. That's what the second part of this deals with. It deals with part 2. It deals in some degrees, there's parts of it that are very similar to the ministerial sexual misconduct policies and procedures that we currently have, and yet some of it is also quite different. So I just want to highlight some key changes between the current document, the ministerial sexual misconduct procedures and the accountability part of the P&A resource. And so one of the first things that will be different moving forward is that reporting can happen in different ways. And so currently, any reporting of misconduct for a credentialed leader comes to the area conference. We're going to change that to also allow for complaints to come through the national office or a different, so either through the area conference or through the national office. And the reason for that is sometimes persons don't feel comfortable reporting abuse through their area conference leadership, not for any reason other than perhaps the person they're reporting misconduct against might be perceived as friends of other staff. And there is a supportive relationship between conference leaders and pastors and staff members. And so sometimes people don't feel comfortable reporting through that. We want to make sure that there's pathways, multiple pathways where people can report. So reporting will happen at the area conference. It still can happen through the same channels, but also can happen through the national office. And there will be a button, like a on the website, there'll be a place that you can hit at the top that says reporting misconduct, and that will go to the denominational minister for church safety. Again, in the past, it was only through the conference. Going forward, persons can report concerns through the area conference or the national body. The other thing that we've made more explicit is the idea. We'll use three words that we haven't used before: discovery, disclosure, and suspicion. And so this deals with how can a report come, or a misconduct report be filed, or what kind of different ways can a misconduct report come to the attention of leaders in both the national level or at the conference. In the past, and still in some national bodies, complaints could only move forward in the system if there was a signed complaint from the person who is actually claiming to be harmed by the person, the respondent, right? And so it was very kind of narrow. It was built on some understandings in both civil and criminal law, and this general notion that a person has a right to face their accuser, which is in like American jurisprudence and also Canadian. That standards are certainly appropriate for civil and criminal law, but we find that it's actually not appropriate in church settings, because what it does is it creates such a high bar for disclosure or to reporting, that it discourages people that otherwise could report or should report misconduct. It discourages them from doing so. And so we use a different framework in this policy that's well defined, and it's based on those three words: disclosure, discovery, or suspicion. So going forward, a complaint can move forward if there's disclosure, which means somebody who is being harmed reports or discloses the concerning behavior, or somebody that's aware of concerning behavior discloses that to a staff or to the conference or to the denomination through the report. Also, though, through discovery, like somebody discovers someone else is being harmed, and makes that report. And so through various means, either they walk into a space in the church and notice something they think is unhealthy, either somebody shares a story, they learn about this another way, or discover that there's abuse that may be happening, they can bring a report forward, and that report will be investigated even without a signed complaint from somebody who's being harmed. And also, and this gets a little bit more discerning, but also if there is suspicion. And so if there's reasonable suspicion that unethical or concerning behavior is happening, as defined by the policy, as defined by the code of conduct and the policy, then it is appropriate for people to bring reports forward. If the suspicion originates from conference staff in relation to other folks, they can also be the source of a complaint. So if this is something people ask about a lot, it does not have to be a complainant that's been harmed who files a signed complaint for this to move forward. Conference leaders, even when they witness violations or ethical violations against the policy itself, can serve as a complainant in a misconduct case. And in that case, they would simply be saying that this pastor or this leader has violated the policy and process, and so therefore we're going to investigate that potential violation. So hopefully that makes sense, but if you read through it, you'll notice those two words: discovery, disclosure, or suspicion. We also use the same threshold for determining whether or not somebody has committed misconduct, and that is whether, more likely than not, they have done the thing they're accused of. So it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not even beyond the preponderance of evidence. The standard we have used and will continue to use is whether or not it's likely, and more likely than not, that a person has engaged in misconduct. So hopefully that makes sense. This webinar format I like in many ways, and in other ways, if we were in a different format, we could ask for questions. But if you have questions, please write those in the Q&A section as we go. Probably the most significant change in this process versus the old process is the administrative structure. How is accountability actually handled administratively? Who are the people that are involved in doing it, and how do we ensure that the policy is being followed? So that administrative structure is very different. There are two key roles in this policy that you'll see when you read through it. And then the first one is what we call the denominational minister of church safety. And that is a new role that actually Nancy has been serving in that role as interim for the last year or so. How long? The last 2 years. Time flies. She's been serving in that role. And the role of the denominational ministry of church safety is to create the administrative framework for screening, for training, and for accountability responses within the Safe Church Department. This person also leads the response team, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. So they're a key staff person at the national level that has oversight of directing the Safe Church Ministry of MCUSA, including the prevention and accountability resource and the response process or the accountability process of that resource. The second person, which is a new role, is what we call the conference safety liaison. And this would be a person that works for the area conference that has direct contact with credentialed leaders and folks in ministerial roles within that conference. And their role is to ensure that local clergy are meeting screening requirements through the credentialing process, that they're meeting all the retraining requirements for healthy boundaries training and any sort of continuing ed training that they have, and then any sort of other ongoing educational requirements that pastors have for their growth, health, and continued growth as ministry. And that may even include things like making sure they come to pastor peer meetings and engage pastors and other kinds of relationships. So there's a denominational minister of church safety, and they have overall oversight of the administrative structure, the screening, training, and response part. And then there's a conference safety liaison, one in every conference that works, or every MCUSA conference that ensures local conference compliance to the national policy. The other thing that the CSL does is they participate as a member of the response team when required. So now we're in the second part of the abuse or the resource, and you can look through that as you have time. So let's talk a little bit about the response process. The current ministerial misconduct policy is when we had it reviewed by Grace and Faith Trust and others that work in this, they noted straight off that we are a small denomination and our policy is regional and internal, which means that under the current policy, when a complaint comes into the executive conference minister or conference minister, that's usually the person that provides support and for area pastors, and the credentialing body is the body that adjudicates the complaints. This is usually the body that has also supported pastors, have done their ordination interviews and made some of those discernments. And likely some people may even serve in congregations led by some of these pastors. And so in the current process, it comes to the executive conference minister who steps out and has an administrative role. And then there's investigators that are normally internally trained by the conference. And then there's an adjudicating body, which also is internal to the conference. So what that creates is kind of a closed loop whereby there's a high level of potential bias, there's a high level of relationality, and it makes it very difficult for complainants, also respondents, and also congregations to receive the support that they need, because in the current policy, the people that would normally be doing the support are now the people that are adjudicating the complaint. So that's where this comes from. What we'll be using now is a national level response team that responds to misconduct complaints, as opposed to the regional local credentialing body. And so when a potential misconduct report is received, there will be a response team that is formed that consists of the denominational minister for church safety and then 3 additional conference safety liaisons. So it'll be the national level staff and then 3 conference safety liaisons from 3 different conferences. One of those persons may be from the conference where the pastor or where the respondent is located. But if there is a case where there is a conflict of interest in that assignment, and a different CSL will serve in that role. And the goal is to have a 4-person team of folks that understand our ethics, understand our policy, understand our theology, understand our system, that have been trained also in an investigation and those kinds of techniques for adjudicating different claims that are outside of the conference system, thus freeing up the conference and conference staff to engage in more support for persons and congregations in those cases. So that is I would say probably the biggest difference that this this accountability process has relative to what became what came before. And so again, their job is that 4-person team, then their job is to administer the process and follow the policy as it's written. Also, or including ensuring there's proper support for complainants, for the accused, and for the congregation, which is also an addition to this response, which isn't present in the current policy. That there'll be intentional engagement with the congregation to help walk the congregation through the process so that they understand the process, they understand what's coming, they understand what maybe they've been accused of and what's happening there. So the congregation is not left in kind of the dark or with this void of information relative to what's happening. The other thing that this team will do is adjudicate the claim, including the judgment and the sanctions, and then communicate those results to the area credentialing bodies who are still responsible in our polity for compliance or monitoring compliance to any sort of sanctions. So that is a big difference. And again, I'm glad to have conversations outside of this context if you want to talk more about that and as you read through it. If you're going to be at the MCUSA convention, there will be a live kind of orientation to this resource with a lot of Q&A, so that we can engage in that context as well. But that is probably the biggest shift from our current policy to this policy, is moving to this national level, or more like a national regional a response team instead of the local church folks and the conference credentialing bodies. Most of whom get called into that ministry and say yes to that ministry, and then learn that if there's a misconduct case, they're the ones that have to adjudicate it, which is a difficult shift for many of them to make. And so we're hoping to create a better process and one that's a little bit safer and also more helpful. The other thing that we got a lot of feedback on relative to the past process and took into account as we were creating this new one is the need for more tools or more flexible pathways relative to misconduct complaints of different sorts. As Nancy mentioned earlier, the 2016 policy was called the Ministerial Sexual Misconduct Policy and Procedure, and it was written for adjudicating ministerial sexual misconduct complaints that could also be used for other kinds of misconduct. That tripped a lot of people up in our system, and it has over time, because it's hard to break that association of this is a sexual misconduct policy and the thing that maybe the pastor is being accused of. It might not be that, but we're still using the same framework. So we have created in this policy some more flexible pathways for dealing with misconduct complaints, and it actually goes in two directions. The first one is that we're much more stringent relative to sexual abuse complaints. So if there's a report or a sexual misconduct complaint against a credentialed leader or a minister in the church, all of those complaints will be investigated by an independent outside investigator, a professional investigator outside of our system. So somebody that has no roles, and they're not a CSL, they're not the national body. We won't do any of the investigation in those cases. If it's a sexual misconduct case, it will go to an independent outside investigator. Also, other abuse complaints such as physical abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, anything that includes an allegation of abuse will be investigated by independent outside investigators. Other types of complaints, although that may be handled in other ways. And so a good example of that might be that there's been a conflict between a leader and a congregant that's festered for a long period, and somebody doesn't feel like they're getting much relief. The church, they feel that the church is unresponsive, and so they might file a misconduct complaint. In the past, we would have had to treat that just like we would any other misconduct complaint. Even when it's apparent that what might be more appropriate is mediation, what might be more important, that might be more prudent is like a conflict transformation context, or maybe even a restorative justice framework. Maybe it's an HR complaint that, so there's all kinds of other things that we would have dealt with using the same tool. This process actually allows the adjudicating body to determine, like in some instances, there might be better ways to talk through or to work through the issues that are present in a particular complaint. And so they will have more freedom to do that. And the thing you'll notice if you read through the policy is that when they make that determination that they're going in an alternative direction, they have to actually write a written justification or rationale for why it is that they're doing that, why they're going the direction they're going, and to make that available to church leaders and to anybody that asks for it. So that's one of the complaints, and so, or one of the changes is this flexible pathways that we have to deal with different sorts of complaints that might come in. You know, the old adage that if all you have is a hammer, every problem's a nail. We have found that has often happened, and we didn't have as many pathways for persons to deal with grievances or issues they were having in the local church that maybe the local church wasn't able to deal with. And out of a frustration, if the only policy or process they had was a misconduct complaint, they would use that venue. That wasn't always the best in every case, and sometimes that did more harm than good, and shut down some other potential avenues that might have bared better fruit. So going forward, just to be clear on this, like if there's a sexual abuse complaint or any complaint that alleges abuse of any sort is defined by the policy, that will be investigated by independent investigators. In other types of complaints, there might be local investigators that are used, lay investigators that may be used, and the adjudicating body itself can make some determinations about some potential other avenues or venues for seeking redress other than that pathway. So again, like everything, glad to talk about that more with you going forward. Let's see, I'm looking at time here. Another thing that has changed that we are implementing is new or more screenings in the screening process. And so as a person goes through the MLI, I'm just trying to flip to the page. We currently do some background checks, local background checks, county level, state level. But we're adding a few more things to that screening. And so when somebody completes the MLI going forward, they will have some similar things. For instance, they will have 3 references supplied directly by the referencee to the national office. That'll include an area conference minister, current employer, personal reference. So there's some references that are consistent with what we have. The background check, though, going forward will include a few more things. They'll have confirmation of education and employment, local criminal record checks, state criminal record checks, FBI criminal record check, which is currently not done. So that would be a new one. A state central child or dependent adult abuse registry check, a state sex offender registry check, motor vehicle record check, and then a professional disciplinary board background check. So these are all the things that we'll be doing screening going forward, which is in addition to what we currently do. Unless you're in Pennsylvania, people in Pennsylvania have done many of these things because their state laws are more stringent. What we're also adding to the MLI process is a psychological assessment, which would just be a fitness for ministry kind of assessment that conference ministers have been asking for many years. This is a good time to add that to that. Internet and social media searches. And then part of the interview process for the MLI, normally now it's done through the denominational minister. There'll also be somebody from church, either a church safety liaison or the denominational minister of church safety will also participate in an interview to ask specific questions about, about abuse preparation, abuse awareness, abuse training, those kinds of things. So that'll be an addition or one of the differences between this current policy and the past one. The only other things that I think are worth pointing out is one of the things we really tried to do in this policy is to provide clearer definitions and a fuller glossary of what we actually are talking about when we're talking about abuse. And so what's in the shared understanding, there's some general headings, but they're not very specific. And so we have a good part of this resource is a glossary of definitions. What is abuse? What is financial abuse? What is a vulnerable adult? What is inappropriate behavior? Like, so some of these things, what is an abuse of power? And so you'll want to take some time. You'll want to take some time with the glossary, looking through those kinds of things. And again, any kind of questions you might have, I'm glad to answer. And the other thing I think that's worth highlighting that we've tried to be clearer in this policy than in the last is this question about is it only credentialed leaders that are accountable to this policy, or are other ministers accountable to this policy? In the old policy, it was clear that anybody that was in a ministerial position was also accountable to the policy. But we wanted to make sure that we clarified that relative to this policy as well. And I'll just read what it says relative to this. It says non-credentialed leaders serving in ministerial leadership roles in an MCUSA conference or congregation are subject to the misconduct policies of MCUSA. So if a person serves in a role that enjoys the power and office of pastor, they are accountable for how they exercise that power. One cannot avoid accountability for one's functioning in a ministerial role by avoiding credentialing. And so this is pretty key to what we understand about ministerial abuse, especially that at its base, it's an abuse of power, and it's abuse of authority for somebody in a ministerial position, right? And so what underlies that is again, this abuse of power that comes with the role, which we can talk about. Like it's not, yeah. So it comes with the role. And we've had people at various points say, well, I don't want the responsibility of that accountability. So I'll serve in the ministerial role, but I don't want to be credentialed. That creates a very tenuous circumstance. I might even say potentially dangerous circumstance. If a person thinks if they're operating out of the pastoral mantle, right, with pastoral authority, and yet they believe that they're out of accountability to any other structures outside of the church or the person, it leaves the church vulnerable. It leaves people vulnerable. And so we want to be really, really clear that if you're functioning as a minister, as a pastor, even if you're not credentialed, you're still accountable to this policy and procedure. In order to do that, we need congregations and conferences to say, yes, we will follow these guidelines. This is what it is that we will do. And so that's a really important piece that we're carrying forward, which I think also needs to be reiterated. In terms of an implementation timeline, of course, this policy is live now. You can look at it, you can read it, you can explore it. We've presented it to CLC. Conference ministers have been involved. It's been vetted by legal. So legal counsel referred to it as thoughtful, thorough, and 100% legal in terms of its provisions and what it does. We tried to use common definitions of abuse, sexual harassment, those things when available and relevant to what it is that we do. And so there's two essential kind of prongs to launching this and going forward. The first one is the conferences now are doing the work of identifying conference safety liaisons and determining how it is they want to approach that work, whether that's going to be a staff person, whether that's going to be a volunteer, or how they get that role functioning. Once the CSLs are identified, there will be an orientation and training that is hopefully we're shooting for early fall of this year. So an orientation to the resource and to the role, but also an investigation training conducted by Grace in partnership with Grace. And Grace stands for Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments, if you want to look up their work and their background. So they will be providing the training and then be operating in this new framework by January 1 of 2026. Rachel Ringenberg Miller and also Rod Hollinger Jansen, who worked with the MLI process, will be working post-August to get the new screening process up and running, also to go live January 1st, 2026. And most of that work will happen post-convention, since they both are doing different roles relative to convention. The other thing that we're doing is reworking all of our healthy boundaries training to bring that training in alignment with this policy in terms of the principles, the definitions, the understandings of how we think about abuse prevention and clergy responsibility in the midst of that. And also to try to bring kind of Anabaptist Mennonite theological understandings to the healthy boundaries aspects of how does who we are as Mennonites impact how we view abuse prevention and accountability. And so we're gathering or have gathered a 5-person team that's going to actually work to create that new training framework for pastors, also to be launched in 2026. And so, yeah, those are some of the implementation aspects. And then we also received, thanks to Nancy's good work, a Showalter grant for the specific purpose of creating video-based asynchronous training videos for congregations to help you get access to good training on safe church abuse prevention and accountability practices for your church. And so we just received that grant, and we're at work trying to figure out how we're going to best use that. And we've had some brainstorming sessions on what that would look like. And so also to come in 2026 is a whole new kind of cadre of resources around a safe church and abuse prevention and response in the local church. So yeah, I think that wraps it up in terms of kind of the differences. I'm now glad to answer any questions that we might have.
Okay, Michael, there were a number of questions that came in while you were talking, and I'll go down those right away, and then we'll pick up some of the ones that were sent to us earlier. One of the first questions that came in, it was when you were talking about flexible pathways in the document. Remember that phrase? They were
Yeah.
wondering if there is a map somewhere to follow that.
No, there's not currently a map to follow, but it is something that we'll be producing. But yeah, that's the short answer. The challenge is that a lot of times when a complaint comes in, there's discernment that's happening relative to the best ways to do that, and it really isn't as like you can imagine like a decision tree, yes, no, put you in different directions. But what we've tried to do is say that, like, if you look to the resource, it will say in these instances, this is when, and this is in the resource, it's not in map form, but it's in list form. This is when it's necessary to have an independent investigation of a particular misconduct complaint. Outside of those specific things, it's the discernment of that group, the 4-person team, to discern what other potential directions you could go, right? And so that would be done in conversation within that team, but also with the complainant and those that are involved in the particular incident, or suspected kind of abuse. So that's why, yeah. So no, that's the quick answer, but do look at the list, yeah, in the response section of the policy.
Mm-hmm. Another question that came in, get back up to the one that I was going to do next. What is the rationale for requiring motor vehicle record checks and psychological assessments? This puts too much confidence in the secular field of psychology and psychiatry.
Yeah, I mean, it's just considered a best practice. It's pretty much the standard in other denominations as well, relative to basic psychological screening. I guess I'm not necessarily sure what it means to place trust in secular. Yeah, anyway, that's maybe a whole conversation. But there are also Anabaptist Mennonite practitioners in the mental health field that actually do ministry assessments, and most people have found them helpful at flagging any sort of really potential or obvious impairments that or situations that might lead to problems in ministry. Or yeah, so yeah, it's just the short answer is that it's considered a best practice, and we have ministry partners, I think, that can do a good job of helping to see that. And we have had cases where there's misconduct that has come that might have been prevented if there would have been some base level screening in terms of psychological health prior to doing it. So yeah,
it can actually be proactive for the individual to get some additional information before they go into their assignment. So it could be very helpful that way.
yes.
Another question is, what is the role of the local church in the local church? Who should know this policy well? Outside the pastoral role, should the elders know this well? Another specific person?
Yes, so some of it depends a bit on how your church is structured, what kind of teams you have in place. If you have a safe church team or a safe sanctuary team that deals with child protective kind of issues, they should be familiar with this. And also the primary leadership group that provides supervision for the pastor should be familiar with this all the way through. So whoever's providing supervision, if that's the elder board, then yes, the elder board. If it's a church council or some other sort of gathering of leaders in the church, whoever supervises the pastor should understand what's expected of the pastor, what's considered healthy behavior and unhealthy behavior. And they should be familiar with that so they can do their role as a supervision better. Yeah. Certainly anybody that's working with youth or children should be aware of some of the best practices, especially in the prevention section. Anybody that's in a ministerial role, especially if they're not credentialed, should also be aware of what's in here and should be aware of the expectations and pastoral ethics and code of conduct and those kinds of things, which are really important. I would say every member should read it, but maybe that might be going a little too far. But at least those key leaders that have oversight of ministries with children and vulnerable adults, and anybody that's in a role of supervising the pastor. PCRCs, if you have a pastor congregation relations committee, it'd be helpful for them to be familiar with it as well, just so that they would understand that process and can provide support for the pastor as well. So especially the front half, the prevention half.
Okay, another question is, how can a person be accountable to this policy if they are not credentialed? Without the participation of the congregation, there is nothing that denomination or conference can do to hold a non-credentialed person accountable.
Yeah, it sounds like more like a statement, but anyway, yeah. Right, this is the challenge, right, of being Anabaptist Mennonites who believe in congregational polity and voluntary association. It works really, really well until somebody transgresses a boundary and hurts somebody else. And then everybody says, well, what kind of accountability can you have? Like, first of all, I would say that if this person is just a lay person in the church, it is up to that local church to hold them accountable to these policies and processes. So that doesn't or shouldn't fall to the national body or to this policy. You should have relationships within your church whereby you say, these are the boundaries we have in our congregation that cannot be transgressed. And if you're harming persons, children, or vulnerable adults in the church, it's the congregation's responsibility to respond to that. Now, the only caveat is if somebody's in a ministerial position, I think the conference and the church should say to that person, we are holding you accountable to this standard. So it's not necessarily a coerced from the outside kind of accountability, but it's a voluntary accountability that the church and the conference and the national body can enter into together and say, look, these are the standards for safety in our communities. This is how we understand it. This is how we practice it. And so you will be held accountable for this. As a conference minister, I had a pastor that said, well, because this document wasn't approved by the delegate body and such a thing, I'm not accountable to it. And I simply said, as the conference that holds your credential, this is the standard that we use, and this is the standard by which you will be evaluated. And if there's a misconduct complaint or a violation against, and what you've been doing is contrary to the ethics in this document, you will not be credentialed anymore in our conference, right? So there are ways that you actually you have to do this and you're responsible to do it, right? And that's why I started with the polity piece, like the congregation, the conference, the denomination. We all have different responsibilities relative to this. I would almost argue that the most power rests in the congregation itself. And that's why it's so imperative for you to do good work in this area. Because if we're waiting to use an accountability process after the fact, then we're cleaning up harm done. We're not preventing harm done. So it really is up to the congregation as the first line of defense and safety in that local community to do this work, right? So I don't know if that answered the question, but
well, you had mentioned earlier too, and the first or the 2016, one of the issues was if somebody didn't want to be held accountable, so then they'd say, I don't want to be credentialed, so that they could do whatever. And that has caused a lot of damage and pain for all involved in that. It's irresponsible.
The red flag, to say the least.
Very red flag, I tell you. Okay, the next question is how does healthy boundaries training prevent abuse? Is there any data to demonstrate that this has done so in the past?
So I'm not aware of any data that shows that healthy boundaries training has helped prevent abuse, because I'm not even sure how you would test it, frankly. And I don't know that anyone that has done this. The thing I think what we want to say is that what healthy boundaries training does is it exposes people to the expectation of appropriate behavior, and it tries to help them create their own kind of internal framework for how they are going to monitor themselves and their relationships with other people. At the end of the day, no training like that can actually, no healthy boundaries training can keep an individual from doing X, Y, or Z if they choose to do that thing, right? Now, would it be better to say that like we should never do healthy boundaries training because in the end, somebody's just going to do what they want to do anyway, right? So therefore, since we don't have any data that this doesn't work, we probably shouldn't do it. I would probably put it in a different framework and just say that healthy boundaries training is an opportunity for people in ministerial roles that want to help people and not hurt people, that want to be healthy and well balanced, that want to be effective in the role. This is where they can learn and maybe learn a little bit more, a broader kind of understanding of what it means to relate in a healthy way to other people, to perhaps engage in conversations with other pastors, to learn and grow, to maybe see some blind spots or potential areas where they might have transgressed had they not been aware of something, and to give them some tools to help make sure that they are healthy and well balanced as well, right? So, yeah, I suppose I don't accept the premise of the question to some degree, that like I do think it's good to do it. I think every time I've taught one or trained one, I've learned something from the people I'm with in the room. And we can always continue to grow and become healthier as ministers. It takes seriously the sacred trust we have as pastors and leaders in the church. So I don't know. That's it's the response that comes to mind, right?
And that sort of answers that last part of that question, because it was a long one, is pastoral misconduct a result of a lack of knowledge?
I mean, yeah, I suppose not. I mean, that's I don't know. Yeah. Do I think that if you just know more stuff that will prevent someone necessarily from transgressing or crossing boundaries? No, there's all kinds of reasons why. Which is why on the screening side of things, you do things like psychological assessments and some of those other things. That's why you do some of those things. So the goal of healthy boundaries is really just to help people get some more tools in their toolkit to deal with self-care, to maybe explore issues of technology and use of ministry. So, but it's not just it's not necessarily just a cognitive exchange of ideas. It's how do we work at this practically as practitioners is a lot of what happens in healthy boundaries trainings, at least the in-person ones.
Whoops. Another question that came up is, what about accountability? We're getting a lot of questions in. What about accountability for the MCUSA investigation and disputed complaint hearing from past complaints?
I don't understand what that is. Maybe you can read it again or help me understand what the question is.
They give an example of a congregation. I don't know if we're going to want to name that congregation, but what about accountability for the MCUSA investigation and disputed complaint hearing from past complaints?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to whoever wrote that offline. I'm not sure I fully understand what they're asking. Are they asking about, is there a process whereby if a congregation doesn't like the outcome of a investigation, that how does the congregation itself dispute that?
Well, what about the accountability? Because they do name a congregation, a certain situation, and wonder what the accountability for the MCUSA investigation and when it's disputed. But maybe that person, and I can give you the name of the person so you could.
Well, yeah, I'm
contact.
glad to talk to them after, you know.
Or the person could, that
I mean-
person who asked that question, we gave Michael's email. So if you want to ask that directly and have more direct conversation, go ahead.
Like in short, when it comes to a misconduct complaint, especially under the current policy, not the new one, but under the old one, but also in the new one, the congregation itself doesn't have standing in the complaint. So it would be the accused and the complainant. Like the complainant and the accused are the two principals, and they have redress relative to appeals if they have material issues with how the investigation happens, the decision that's made or adjudicated. But there really isn't a formal way for the congregation to engage in that. If the question is, can a congregation file a misconduct complaint against a particular investigator? I suppose that's a possibility. That's not happened, but yeah, that's a conversation to have. It's just a little bit hard to know what they're asking. So.
One question, a comment about how the new policy and a shared understanding of ministerial leadership relate. And you mentioned some of that, but do you want to give a quick? And I have at least 2 more questions just coming in besides what was sent.
I want to be conscious of time. It's 8:01.
Yeah.
Essentially, the parts of the shared understanding that we actually early on, the long answer is we thought about doing a complete rewrite of the shared understanding, but the actual theological understanding of leadership in the front part of the shared understanding is actually solid, and it wasn't anything that we really felt we needed to change. So that's one. The other part of a shared understanding is the ordination, the frameworks of the different kinds of credential types, which are not changing. Eventually, we are going to add a spiritual director category for the credential for certain kinds of specific licenses and credentials. But that whole credentialing, ordination, license towards ministry, the credential statuses around suspended credentials, probation, all those things, none of that was going to change. So therefore, we didn't feel like we needed to rewrite that. In the pastoral ethics section, we just determined that there were definite, like they were very broad, kind of like abuse of power, like somebody can have a misconduct complaint for abuse of power, but that wasn't defined. So what we tried to do is take the parts of the shared understanding that dealt with pastoral ethics and especially ethical violations that would trigger a credential review. We tried to fill those out with more robust definitions so there was more clarity about what it is we were talking about. So when we talk about abuse of power or spiritual abuse, what is that exactly? Because if you don't have a clear definition of it, it can mean almost anything. So that's the part of the shared understanding that we've augmented or tried to fill in a bit more with the new resource, right? And then the shared understanding doesn't have anything about abuse prevention. Neither did the other ministerial misconduct abuse or policy and procedure. So we added that whole section. I don't know if that helps.
Let's take another question, or I realize, yeah, we're past 8.
We're past time.
Yeah. Quickly, one question was about in private service sectors, many organizations have statements of ethics, which addresses the spectrum. And these statements are posted that all persons, employees, and everyone are aware of. And the question is this too far out of the church organizations, ecclesiastical organizations? No, it's part of the answer.
I don't think I understand the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Is the question, should we post all of the ethical guidelines?
They're just wondering, yeah, is it too far out of line for within the church organizations that have statements of ethics, which shared understanding would have has an ethics section.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe we need to pull this to an end. There's a few more questions, but please, everyone, if you didn't get your question answered and you want to have an answer, please feel free to Michael's email address was given in the chat. My address was given in the chat, so feel free to contact us. I want to thank you all for who have joined us, but I want to give you a blessing before we leave. And go from there. So please receive this blessing. May God bless your ministry in a special way that gives you life and blesses others. As God watches over you, may you continue to keep your heart and mind open to receive what God has for instruction to you as you move forward. Go in peace and blessings to you. And thank you.